This is NPR.
From the Ideas Network, it's To the Best of Our Knowledge. I'm Jim Fleming. First, there was the 12-step program. Then along came the inner child, confessions of codependency, and adult children of, you name it. The so-called recovery movement is so fashionable now, we make jokes about it. We wear buttons that say, "My inner child made me do it." The New Yorker prints cartoons with captions like self-harm books, daily denials, and 50 thoughtless things you can do to ruin the planet. But behind the jokes, what's going on? Is America really healing its inner ills, or has therapy gone too far? In this hour, critics of self-help claim the recovery movement is turning adults into victims. Also, how to get all the psychotherapy you want without paying a dime. And a best-selling analyst claims some depression is good for you.
Depression gives us weight. You know, the alchemists and the early physicians said that the metal of depression is lead. It's heavy. And I noticed that quite a number of people who talk to me about chronic depression are very light, sort of flighty. I can see then that depression might be giving them some weight.
There's a cartoon you see in some therapist's office. A picture of a person sitting alone in the middle of a big, empty auditorium. The caption reads, "Annual Meeting of the Adult Children of Normal Parents." And that about sums up the way some people see today's 30 and 40-somethings. An entire generation that's labeled itself adult children. Dysfunctional, codependent, and proud of it. Now there's even a member of the therapy generation in the White House. A president who's talked on national television about his abusive stepfather. Does that mean recovery is here to stay? I asked writer Wendy Kaminer, author of a biting critique of the self-help movement titled "I'm Dysfunctional, You're Dysfunctional." Ms. Kaminer, is it just coincidence that Bill Clinton's been elected during this self-help craze, or is he really the politician who epitomizes the movement?
You know, I think in some ways Bill Clinton is the politician who gives lie to the movement, because Bill Clinton, if you look at the story of his life, he presents the classic profile of the codependent that you get from recovery books. He had an abusive stepfather. He has a brother who has substance abuse problems. He has an alleged history himself of sexual infidelities, which people in the movement would say shows that he's a sex addict. He obviously has a junk food problem, so they would say he has an eating disorder because he eats compulsively. According to the popular recovery literature, Bill Clinton should be a basket case, but in fact, Bill Clinton is highly functional. He obviously had some kind of strength and a lot of intelligence and some kind of resilience that allowed him to cope very successfully with this difficult family situation that he came from without the help of the 12-step program.
I suppose, though, that he should, given all of those things, also be an addict of self-help recovery books.
Which he's not, as far as we know. I certainly hope he's not. It would make me feel bad if I thought he was. But, you know, I thought about Bill Clinton a little bit in the context of the recovery movement because a couple of months before the Democratic Convention, I had a dream that he held a press conference and announced to the world that he was codependent, because it was so easy to imagine what the 12-step spin on what were then considered his character problems would be. You know, they would talk about his abusive family, and they would, you know, he would say that he was addicted to sex, and he was addicted to junk food, and he was addicted to power, and that would explain everything. And of course, he didn't do that, to my great relief, but I thought it was interesting that during or right before the Democratic Convention, he did reveal something about his alcoholic family background, and he did even say at one point that maybe his reputation for trying to please everybody was a reflection of his childhood in an alcoholic home.
Would you assume that announcement was, that he was advised to make that announcement because of the popularity of this kind of confession?
In part. I think that he made that announcement for a couple of reasons. One is that people tended to think of him as a sort of social peer of George Bush. You know, the assumption was that he had come from a fairly well-to-do family and gone through Ivy League schools, and I think that it was important to make it clear that he had a rather hard working class background. Certainly the fact that we now have this tradition of testifying about your family problems made it easier for him to do that. But I think beyond that, there's a way in which this story about a dysfunctional family background has become our new log cabin story. It is our new triumph over adversity. Not everybody can claim to have had an outhouse in their backyard, but everybody can claim to have survived a dysfunctional family. So I think it worked very well as a metaphor.
A couple of times now you have used the phrase the 12-step program. You may not believe it, but there are probably people who don't know what a 12-step program is.
I'm so happy to hear that. I'm always happy to hear that. A 12-step program, AA was the original 12-step program. The 12 steps are basically just a series of maxims or mandates about how to deal with an addiction. One of the first steps is to surrender your will to a higher power. Other steps include such things as making amends to the people that you have wronged. God, I can't remember them off the top of my head, but they're basically like a series of slogans. It started with AA in the 1980s. Popular psychology experts seized upon this model and seized upon this notion of addiction that came out of AA and began to apply it very broadly and rather mindlessly to a wide range of bad habits, like shopping too much or dating too much or eating too much, so that suddenly any bad habit became an addiction and ought to be treated with this AA 12-step program. What is ridiculous about them is not so much the fact that they might limit themselves to such a narrow class, people with children, people who smoke, people who don't smoke, people with certain sexual orientations, but that we have groups for problems like codependency, which is really a non-problem, which is just this very open-ended condition, that it comprises any habit imaginable, any unwanted behavior, any unwanted feeling. And we somehow call, we have found a way to call being unhappy or having problem in your life a disease. And unhappiness is not a disease. Unhappiness is just part of life. There's really no cure for it. There's not even a 12-step program for it.
Now, some of these actually work, though. You said that No, I shouldn't say that. I guess that reveals my prejudices. All my life I've been brought up to believe that AA works, that it's a good thing, that the people who founded it didn't do so for any reason of personal gain, but because they needed help. And
AA works for some people. There's no doubt about that. I think there is equally little doubt that it doesn't work for everybody. And it's interesting. I mean, it seems to me that we ought to be able to say AA is not a panacea. AA is one treatment program that works for some people and doesn't work for other people.
Is it the movement itself that bothers you, or is it the way in which people respond to it? I mean, there's some of them that are laughable, I think, that we look at and say, oh, come on, that's just a bunch of con artists in operation. But then there are people who are fooled by it. I guess I want to know which way it bothers you the most.
People are the movement. I don't think you can separate the movement from the way certain people react to it. I'm bothered by the ideology of the movement. I'm bothered by this ideology about victimization and addiction and abuse. I'm also bothered, though, with the way people seem to just buy these books and read them and parrot what they say. A lot of people seem to parrot it somewhat unthinkingly. And we have, I guess I'm troubled by mass movements in general because they're so very conformist. And we think of the self-help tradition as being so individualistic. I think of it as being very, very conformist.
Are there any political consequences of the self-help movement, do you think?
I think Ross Perot, in some ways, is a political consequence of the self-help movement. We think of Clinton and Gore as our post-therapy candidates, but I saw Ross Perot as being the personal development candidate in a way. I saw him as the personal development expert, as presidential candidate. And I think the political danger that I see in the self-help movement, that the danger of people not thinking for themselves, the danger of them delegating their own responsibility to deal with problems to experts. That's what I saw in the Ross Perot movement. I mean, Perot presented himself as the expert. He said, hire me, I'll fix this. I'm the guy who looks under the hood. And he didn't really need to have a platform because his platform was simply his claim to expertise and he embodied expertise in the way that personal development experts do. I mean, he reminded me of Anthony Robbins or Werner Erhard. Watching him, I felt that I was watching a motivational seminar.
What's the future of the recovery movement, do you think?
That's a good question. When I published my book, which was a year ago, the recovery movement had already peaked and seemed to be entering a period of decline. Book sales were down. Conferences were down. There aren't many recovery experts who can find work on the lecture circuit anymore. That has kind of dried up, except for the superstars and the televangelists like John Bradshaw. But, I think that personal development experts are particularly expert in spotting and exploiting trends. And they understand that the recovery movement has come under a lot of criticism, that people are a little tired of it. They're tired of all this stuff about victimization and addiction. The new buzzword now in the personal development field is resilience. And so I think that the recovery movement's experts, some of the experts, may start talking about resilience. Because what I've been hearing them doing in the last year is reinventing the movement.
Wendy Kaminer, thank you for talking with us.
My pleasure.
Wendy Kaminer is the author of I'm Dysfunctional, You're Dysfunctional, The Recovery Movement and Other Self-Help Fashions. Critics of the self-help movement, like Wendy Kaminer, worry that it will create a nation of passive victims, people who can't think for themselves. But self-help, to many of those who've experienced it, does exactly the opposite. Take, for example, something called re-evaluation counseling, or co-counseling, a form of therapy in which two people get together and agree to counsel each other. There's no doctor and no patient, no authority, no rules, and no bill. Just a community of people who take turns listening and talking for free. Janet Foner, one of the national leaders of the movement, calls it the ultimate empowerment. Judith Strasser asked her to describe a typical session.
The co-counseling session is two people getting together and agreeing on the amount of time they're going to spend. It's often an hour each way, but I do regularly an hour and a half each way. And then I do shorter sessions on the phone, 10 minutes each, 15 minutes each. You decide at the time how long you want to do this for.
With one particular person?
I have a regular person. Most people have a regular person with which they establish a relationship over the years, but you also have many other co-counseling relationships with people that you work with less frequently.
So what is it? What happens?
So here's the process. Two people get together. They agree on the amount of time that they're going to exchange. One person is the listener or the counselor. The other person is the client or the talker. And the person who's doing the listening is also going to listen in a particular way, that they're going to be very aware, they're going to keep their mind off of their own distress, and there are different methods we use to do that. And they're going to focus entirely on the other person as much as they can, paying loving attention to that person. You have the attitude of being completely confident in that person, that you care about them deeply, and you do. You know, if you don't in the beginning, you certainly develop it over time. And you are completely aware that that person is whole, there's nothing wrong with them. All they need to do is recover how they've gotten separated from their natural self, that they're not trying to improve themselves or fix themselves. So then when you're the talker, you will talk about whatever you want to, which could be all the good things happening in your life. We usually start with that, which could be some problem that you want to solve, goals you want to set, ways you want to change your life, any number of things. you as the client decide what you want to work on. The counselor, the listener, does not analyze you, but rather supports and listens to you. For instance, let's say your goal is you want to do public speaking, and you're terrified to do it. So the counselor might ask you, well, when was the first time you had to speak publicly, which would probably be, say, when you were, 8 years old, you were in a play at school or something. And so you talk about that, and usually you'll start laughing or shaking or both about what was scary for you as a young child doing that. And you will bring up all the incidents related to that time that happened after that. You will often think of more and more incidents that got you scared to do public speaking. And as you continue along, and this could take many, many sessions, or it might only take a few, depending on how deeply you got hurt around that subject. As you shake and laugh, and maybe you'll cry or whatever, you release the emotions around how you got hurt. And as you do that, you recover your ability to think. This is why it's called reevaluation counseling, because you reevaluate how you got hurt. So the difficulty that you have in public speaking disappears.
Does the person who's taking the listening role ever say anything, or does that person just listen until it's time, until the roles are switched and it's time for him or her to talk?
The person does a lot more than just listen. When they first start doing co-counseling, they will basically just pay attention to each other because they don't know what to say or what not to say. You have to sort of get rid of how you've been conditioned to give advice and to analyze and so on and so forth, because we all do that, not just therapists. Then as you become aware of when you're giving advice and when you're saying the wrong thing and so on, then you can begin to say the right thing. And the right thing differs in every situation. For instance, if you were saying that you hate yourself, it wouldn't necessarily be good for me to say, no, you don't hate yourself, because that would be just sort of arguing with where the person is stuck. What you want to do is provide a viewpoint outside of that for the person. So you might say, tell me ways that you like yourself. Or you might say, I think you're a great person. I mean, this is sort of very simplistic because,
Sure.
Each situation is different. Sure. But you would basically provide ways for the person to see that they really are fine.
It's interesting because when you first started talking, I thought, well, this is no different than what a good friend would do, listen and support, affirm, whatever. And then I thought, well, no, actually this is no different than what a good therapist would do. And then by the time you were done, it sounded like, well, it was a cross between what a good friend and a good therapist would do. Am I off base?
No, it's actually what everybody's always trying to do. And unfortunately, it's kind of like, when you go down to the corner bar and everybody's talking to Joe, the bartender, because he's a good listener. But everybody's talking at once. Nobody's taking turns. And, of course, Joe never gets listened to. So what we've actually done is taken a natural human process and put it into a practice whereby you take turns. And that's the key essential difference between what good friends would do and what co-counselors do.
Do people have to be trained before they start doing these sessions?
Yes, we do have co-counseling classes that people learn how to do this with each other. And the other difference between therapy and co-counseling, a lot of therapists will allow people to cry and laugh and shake and so on, but they will also not usually be aware of how much of that needs to go on. People need to sob and cry for hours and hours and hours, and usually that's considered mental illness. Whereas I often do hours of crying in co-counseling sessions in 1 week. Most people would think I was falling apart or something, but I'm not, because I do 3 full-time jobs, and people often ask me, well, how do I do that? Well, I do it because I get to do this emotional release very often.
What constitutes success in co-counseling? I mean, it sounds like it's a never-ending process from the way you've been describing it.
It is. And again, this is a very sharp difference between co-counseling and therapy, because we're not trying to fix ourselves. What we're trying to do is move things forward in our lives, assist the people around us as well as ourselves to function elegantly. And as you continue to do it, you realize this is what I should have had all along, from childhood on, that if I would have had somebody to listen to me and support me, I would be able to do a lot more than what I ended up doing.
Janet Foner is the International Reference Director for Mental Health System Survivors in Reevaluation Counseling and the co-coordinator for Support Coalition International. She lives in New Cumberland, Pennsylvania.
Coming up next, the art of psychotherapy and the care of the soul. It's To the Best of Our Knowledge from the Ideas Network.
Major support for To the Best of Our Knowledge is provided by the Promega Corporation of Madison, Wisconsin, accelerating the pace of discovery worldwide through reagents and systems for life science research. If you've discovered a new idea or opinion on To the Best of Our Knowledge and would like to comment or want more information, write to us. Our address is To the Best of Our Knowledge, 821 University Avenue, Madison, Wisconsin, 53706.
Think of the moment, maybe you've experienced it yourself, when an ordinary person struggling with something, a marriage, a divorce, a death, sits down in front of a therapist for the first time. One of them asks a question, the other answers. How do you describe what happens next? Well, you could make a transcript. You could even videotape it. You could analyze it scientifically, frame by frame. But would you have gotten anywhere near understanding how one person can, maybe, heal another? Harvard psychiatrist Leston has been practicing psychotherapy for many years, and for nearly as many, he's been trying to explain it. Not as a science, but, as the title of his new book suggests, as an art. Margaret Andreasen asked him how he'd describe what a therapist does.
Probably the most important thing that the therapist does is listen, make themselves available, receive the ideas and feelings of the patient, and see if they can be processed between the two of them in a way that opens the world up or as the title of this book is, it helps the patient come to life.
I want to know more about that process. It seems to me, for example, that anybody who has a friend who's willing to listen, or even a loyal dog who's willing to listen, might not need a therapist.
Oh, I think that's quite true. But I don't know about the dogs, although I have a dog that my wife and children and I love, but I'm not so sure that Harry Hoopham and Havens is quite the receiving instrument that we need. But friends can be. Real friends are people, in my judgment, who one can be open with and also close to, which is a very surprising thing in human life, where so many dangerous things happen between people. To find someone you can be both open with and close to and not be taken advantage of. And also someone, I think it's important to say, someone that you can be alone with, that you don't have to worry about what they're thinking about you. But when you can find people like that, you very often don't need a psychotherapist. But let me tell you, from a long experience of patients in human life, those relationships are rare. So if you have to pay for that, you shouldn't be ashamed, because it's very hard to find in human life. Men particularly have relatively few friendships of that kind, and women have more friendships, but in women's friendships you often see them taking advantage of rather than being safe.
I want to understand this difference between taking advantage of and being safe. What does a therapist do that makes the therapist safe?
The first thing is listening, receiving what there is. And very often the best form of listening, oddly enough, is talking, because there are people that if you're just silent and listen to them, they can't talk, they freeze up. So often therapists have to talk a lot themselves, reveal themselves even, so that the person learns that they can be trusted, or they're the right kind of person for the other individual. But sooner or later, certain kinds of things come into view. For example, it's very, very common to discover that someone seems to you odd or wrong or sick. That's a viewpoint that we often feel toward each other. You see it in the playground where the children call each other mental or something of that kind. And when that moment comes, you have to be very careful, because what it usually means, in my experience, is we have different perspectives. The two parties have different perspectives. But as it goes along, there are kinds of things about the person's difficulties in life that you would like to do something about. The classic instance is of someone who over and over again encounters a problem they can't overcome. They can't quite give themselves, for example, to another person, or they can't find work they really love. And then the therapist has his or her work cut out for them. How do you help people get over their hesitations? How do you help people gain the courage? How do you help people believe in themselves so they can do the things they need to do? That's, in my opinion, that's the largest part of what therapeutic work is about.
How do you do that? How do you get a person to believe in him or herself? How do you
do it? I mean, you do it. You've got to get me right now to believe in myself during these interviews. And you've got to be able to do something that makes me feel reasonably safe here, even maybe makes me feel oddly enough and perhaps weirdly important for a moment, right? So that my thoughts will come out, what they're worth. That has to happen, and you do it. You know how you do it. You're patient, you listen, you're enthusiastic, you're amused. You do all the things that hopefully you really feel, that makes the other person feel that there's something alive between two people.
Let's pretend that I've come to see you. I as a patient, you as a therapist. I've come to see you, and I've just knocked on your door for the first visit. What happens then?
I open the door.
Yes.
And I probably gesture toward a chair or a couch or something where you're going to sit down.
Now, where is this chair or couch in relation to you?
Well, it varies. It's in a settled place with me, but the schools of psychiatry tend to place their practitioners in different positions vis-a-vis the patient.
That's very interesting. Well, tell me.
Well, in the most famous and often ridiculed position in psychotherapeutic work is an analysis where the doctor sits behind the patient and is out of view of the patient because the patient lies down. The idea of that was to let the patient lie down in a kind of sleep-like state so they could free associate, speak more freely, and the doctor wouldn't interfere by his presence. And that's sometimes a very useful notion. The greatest of the American psychiatrists, Harry Stack Sullivan, thought that the doctor and the patient ought to sit side by side so that the doctor could be on the patient's side. Also because he wanted the patient and doctor to look out at the world, because he saw the problems not the way the analyst did, as emerging from within the mind or the psyche, but instead from a relationship between the patient and the world. That's why it was called interpersonal or social psychiatry. Most of us, however, sit more or less opposite to our patients, but at enough distance so the person has a kind of space of their own away from them.
What is it you really want to learn? Do you want to learn about my distant past?
Oh, I don't want to learn anything. You don't want to tell me. I like to mind my own business in this work. I want you to decide, to be comfortable. I don't want to be intrusive. The soul, the mind is just like the body. You have to treat it very tenderly. You can't rush up to it and begin to cut into it like a mad surgeon. You have to anesthetize the areas that you're going to investigate. And psychological anesthesia is a very difficult thing for people to learn. But it involves things like protecting people's self-esteem, understanding them very well, helping them gain a future, all those things which make it possible to touch things enormously painful and not be so frightened or overwhelmed that you won't ever touch them again.
Well, let me ask the question in another way. What is it that you have to learn in order to be really useful to me?
What do I have to learn? Oh, I don't know. I really don't know. There's no rule about that. Each of the schools has an answer to it. The analysts want to know about the unconscious complexes. The social psychiatrists want to know about the different interpersonal binds that people get into. The existentialists want to know what your value and the nature of your being in the world, et cetera, et cetera. And then there are various habits that the behaviorist people think you need to master, et cetera. There are various different things, and often they overlap very much. But in fact, I'm not so sure it's a question of what you have to learn. It isn't like a school exercise where the patient says something, you explain it back to them. Some people practice that way, but I haven't found that very useful. It's more that the person's perspective becomes entwined with your own, reshaped a little bit by your own. They see a little more of the world, maybe. They gain a little more courage to do the things they want to do. Or such a dramatic thing as finding out what's for you. What is it that you really want? Have you been selling your soul to things you don't want? Have you been following other people's advice when you really have a different vocation, et cetera, et cetera? Those are often the things that seem important to it. Existentialists want to know what your value and the nature of your being in the world, et cetera, et cetera. And then there are various habits that the behaviorist people think you need to master, et cetera. There are various different things, and often they overlap very much. But in fact, I'm not so sure it's a question of what you have to learn. It isn't like a school exercise where the patient says something, you explain it back to them. Some people practice that way, but I haven't found that very useful. It's more that the person's perspective becomes entwined with your own, reshaped a little bit by your own. They see a little more of the world, maybe. They gain a little more courage to do the things they want to do. Or such a dramatic thing as finding out what's for you. What is it that you really want? Have you been selling your soul to things you don't want? Have you been following other people's advice when you really have a different vocation, et cetera, et cetera? Those are often the things that seem important to us. Because you don't want to wake up at 40 or 50 and feel that the 40 or 50 years have been spent in something which is not really yours.
What if I'm just full of defenses?
Well, I hope you are. You need them, boy.
Well, but we've been seeing each other now in this setting for 20 visits, and I seem to be exactly where I was when I started. Mm-hmm. What are you going to do to push me? How am I going to get on the right track?
Well, I don't know. It depends on who you are, I mean, for example, maybe you're fine. Maybe you don't need to see me. Maybe someone told you to come, or someone convinced you were crazy and you're not. That happens a lot. Maybe you're just fine. Maybe my job is to convince you that you don't need to be here. I've had cases like that.
But what if you think I do need to be there? Then what
do you need to be there?
Yeah, then what do you say?
Well, if I don't say that, obviously. In fact, I probably don't say much. Maybe if you say to me, look, I don't know what I'm doing here, and you say, well, I might say perhaps you don't need to be here. I also say, well, but you keep coming back to A, B, or C, or you keep telling me that you feel bad about yourself, or this, so that I might bring you back to what it was you said that troubled you.
How do you know when you've succeeded with me? It seems to me.
I don't. I don't want. I'm not even sure I want to know that. I want you to know that. You're the customer.
As I hear you talk, I feel you're describing an art more than you are a science.
Well, don't make such a sharp, if I may suggest it, don't make such a sharp distinction between art and science. If you talk to great scientists, they talk about their work like an art. And you talk to artists, and they talk very scientifically about technique and how to apply things and how to look and how to establish perspective. Art and science are not nearly so different as people have come to think. There's a lot of sort of routine science that goes on, and there's a lot of routine art that goes on. But they're not so different. They both depend upon being able to form interesting different ideas, to test them out in life, to be careful about how the work is done, and maybe they both also have the same objective, which is to get at the real. What's it really like, The great Cezanne said that he didn't want to paint pictures. He wanted to be able to see things the way they really were, And that sounds like science, doesn't it?
Well, yes, I guess it does. We are a society, I think, in some respects, obsessed with how our heads work.
I hope we are, because our heads are very important.
But one of the results of that is that we have a lot of pop psychology around and lots of fads in self-help. What do you make of all the talk about?
I think it's wonderful that people have lots of ideas and things they are enthusiastic about and want to sell to each other, and that the self-help movements, the AA movement, those have been enormously valuable to thousands of people. Oh, that's good. That's the strength of our country, that 1,000 flowers bloom. A million different things come. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, but in that competitive, open atmosphere, people can at least get a hearing and again have meaning in what they're doing.
But does that mean that all of us need psychotherapy?
Well, I'll tell you now, this may be a foolish thing to say, but if you were to ask me, do all patients need to have their bodies looked after at some point? Whether it's at their time of their birth, or when they get chicken pox, or when they get older and have a heart attack, or later when they are assisted in their demise. The answer would obviously be all need help with our bodies. Now, is our mental functioning, which may be, if anything, more important, is that foolish to think that at some time or other we might all seek, if only from our friends, or if only from self-help manuals, or if only in self-help groups, or from someone else? Is it surprising that we should not think of our minds as much in need of assistance as any other part of ourselves? It doesn't seem foolish to me.
Thank you. Thank you for talking with us today, Leston Havens.
Well, thank you for having me.
Leston Havens is a professor of psychiatry at the Harvard Medical School. His new book is Coming to Life, Reflections on the Art of Psychotherapy.
You
May and Mike Nichols examined Doctors from their 1962 album. It's To the Best of Our Knowledge from the Ideas Network. One of the most popular psychology books this year, already in its 13th printing, sounds from the title as though it belongs in the religion section of the local bookstore. Care of the Soul, by Jungian analyst Thomas Moore, has been on the New York Times bestseller list for nearly 4 months. It evidently has a message that is hitting home, and that message, as Moore told Steve Paulson, is about the importance of something that doesn't usually get discussed in therapy sessions: the soul.
Thomas Moore, what does the care of the soul mean to you?
Well, as I usually answer that question, I start out with a negative approach to it, saying what it does not mean. It does not mean making myself better. It doesn't mean solving problems. It does not mean finding the reasons why I am who I am. It doesn't mean blaming anybody for the experiences that I have, whether it's parents or relatives or a trauma or anything like that. Care of the soul means, given all that history, given the person that I am, that I try to allow myself to live as fully as I can in my own situation, with all my good stuff and all my bad stuff.
Well, I'm curious about some of the things that you said it's not about. It's not about becoming a better person, which doesn't sound like such a bad thing to me. And it's not about trying to figure out the reasons for why you are the way you are, again, which doesn't seem like such a bad thing.
They don't seem like bad things, but they are. They're problems, because we can be distracted, for one thing. We can be so distracted in trying to figure ourselves out, which is really pretty much a mental exercise. It doesn't necessarily get us anywhere. Really, you can come to some understanding of why you are who you are, or why you're having some difficulty that you're having, and that understanding doesn't go very far. It really doesn't solve any problem. What it does a lot of times is divide ourselves from other people, because that understanding may imply that someone else did something bad to us.
So you're saying the common approach in many therapists' office, for instance, for trying to find out old family patterns, how, say, your mother or your father affected you, often that is counterproductive? I
think it is. I'm not saying that it's not useful to tell the stories of childhood and in family. That's very important. I mean, the family is as I try to say in this book of mine, Care of the Soul, the family is really a hothouse for soul. I mean, you can't get a more soulful place or a more soulful thing than family. But I think what we do is we move away from the soul of the family, which is its richness, its personality, and its own tradition, and also its problems and its gaps and holes. We get away from the soul of the family when we try to understand it, to make it right.
Well, can you tell me what a soulful experience is?
I can describe it. It's not easy to say exactly what a soulful experience is. I can describe it. I think that when, let's say, you meet somebody, a person, and you feel not necessarily that you're compatible or that you share the same ideas, but you feel a connection, that it has some mystery to it, that feels deep, it touches you at a level, maybe awakens something in you that you haven't really felt before. That might be a sign of the soulful aspects of the person, or of at least this relationship. Another aspect of soul is individuality. And this is a traditional teaching, by the way, that it's the soul that makes us human. And I'm adding a little to that, saying that it's the soulfulness that makes us individual. It's so easy to think of ourselves as being normal or healthy or adjusted, or be concerned about these things. But all those words suggest belonging to a group, like everyone's healthy, or being normal means like being like everybody else, or being like certain other people. But soulfulness has to do with really being an individual. And I think when you meet a soulful person, you sense that unique individuality very strongly. You go to a soulful place, and there's no other place like that on earth. I don't think that going into a restaurant that is a chain, where you can go into the same restaurant across the country and see the same design and architecture and the same costumes and all that kind of thing, and the same menu, I don't think you sense much soul in that.
Soul tends to be a religious word. It's something that various spiritual traditions refer to. Are you consciously drawing on those traditions?
Yes, absolutely, because I think that one of the aspects of the soullessness of our lives is a loss of religion and spirituality. The soul needs a religious life. The soul needs a spiritual life, and a soulful reflection on our experience requires a theological point of view. In some way, I'm not recommending any particular religious tradition at all. And I don't care if your point of view is fundamentalist or very enlightened or religious humanist or evangelical or whatever it is. That's not important. The important thing is to have an awareness that the soul needs religion. And
what do you mean by religion, then?
Well, it means that we need a sense of the sacred in everything that we do. One of the examples that I frequently give is that churches, religions have taught us for centuries the importance of people coming together around a meal. Now we get this in Christianity with the Last Supper, and we get it in the ritual of the communion rite. But that's only one example. Many, many religious traditions have similar rituals. I think that we can understand from that there's something about people coming together, even if it's a family gathering in your home, where you give it special attention, where ritual has a very important place, where quality of materials, like maybe some candles, some special food, utensils, plates, attention is given to all of these things. It's very simple, but we learn from the religions that this then makes this gathering a sacred thing. And it may stay in memory for a long time. It may have a very strong effect of helping a family keep its identity and hold together and support itself. These things are very important from the point of view of soul. From the point of view of a secular life, they may not mean anything.
Well, they tend to be considered by most people as aesthetic experiences.
Yes.
It's nice to have those candles on the table.
Right.
It sort of creates a certain atmosphere. You're saying that there's something much deeper than that.
I am, because if we treat these things as aesthetic, then we're not recognizing their role, the essential role they play, and the way we deal with them. Then the way we even care for our homes, then will be shallow. Because aesthetics doesn't reach nearly as deep as care of the soul that has a religious connotation.
So really what you're out to do, in part, is to bridge that gap between, I suppose what we could say is religious experience or spiritual experience and the kind of stuff that most modern psychologists talk about.
Yes, I think that religion and psychology has suffered from being divorced from each other. Psychology has become so secular. This whole practice of blaming people and family for our problems, those things are very secular. They don't reach very deep. They're almost mechanical explanations of who we are.
Can you give me an example of what you would say the typical psychotherapist might do that is not terribly helpful?
Well, I don't want to really split myself off that much from what the psychotherapist is doing, because in my experience, most therapists have this religious dimension. Their theories don't.
Even though they would almost never say that openly.
Yes, even though they would not say it openly, I think they do, at least the people I know. So I really don't feel comfortable saying these therapists are making all these mistakes. From what I can see, most therapists are doing a good job. It's their theories that are weak. It's the whole notion of what therapy is, and also maybe people who go to a therapist expecting quick cures, or go to a therapist almost as they would go to an auto mechanic or to a physician.
Well, if we follow up on that notion that there's something wrong with the theories of much modern therapy, can you give me an example of the problem with trying to cure these difficulties?
Well, an example I give in my book, Care of the Soul, is depression. And I have a case there of a priest who was very depressed, and how we worked with that depression. And my attitude, which I have learned primarily from my studies in Renaissance writings, European Renaissance, is that we have to honor the depression. I also get this from my teachers, the James Hillman, Jung. The idea there would be to, first of all, not chase this depression away, thinking that it's a negative thing and therefore shouldn't be in a person's life. See, the medieval view was that Saturn, or a Saturnine temperament, or a Saturnine mood, was just part of experience. It was one of the humors that make up every human life. See, that's very different than our modern view, that somehow it's an aberration, or it's caused by something that went wrong somewhere. So what I do is, in the case I describe in the book as an example, I listen to dreams. People who are depressed still dream. Sometimes, maybe they don't, but a lot of people do. This particular man was able to paint. He loved to paint and do watercolors. And almost every week in our sessions he would bring in paintings to me. And we would talk about the paintings, not explicitly about depression necessarily, but about the paintings. And I think this was a way of caring for the soul in its depressed place with this person.
But still, for someone who's depressed, it's seriously depressed, it's such a bleak emotion. It's scary. And
yes.
I'm wondering, and what does honoring depression mean to that person who's really mired in it?
Well, I can myself as a therapist, let's say, I can feel tremendously for this person, for the pain that's going on, and maybe even wish that there was some magic I could perform to get them out of it. But if I really am committed to caring for the soul of this person, I'm not going to indulge myself in those fantasies of trying to be the one who cures this person, or to want to rescue them from what they're experiencing, or save them from those experiences.
Are you saying that there was a good side to this depression?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
What was
there's
the
a good
side?
The good side is, well, if you want to be very specific, this person was able, through the depression, to see aspects of his own life, including his past and some of his important relationships, in ways he had never been able to see before, because he always took a cheery view of life. And this depression made him feel bitterness more and be able to express himself and have a perspective that was more bitter than he'd ever allowed himself before. He had no choice now. He was just being dragged down. He had less patience with people around him who were trying to give him, very superficial friendships and relationships. He had no patience for that anymore. And he became more impatient as a person. I thought it was very good for him to be able to express those things. And he felt the same way. And also, I think what depression gives is, and this is a traditional view, that depression gives us weight. The alchemists and the early physicians said that depression is lead. The metal of depression is lead. It's heavy. And it's not just a problem of feeling heavy. It gives us the weight in life that we need. And I noticed that quite a number of people who talk to me about chronic depression are very light. They don't have much personal weight in their lives. They are very light, sort of flighty people very often. And I can see then that depression might be giving them some weight.
Do you have any particular suggestions for people who would like to bring more of the sacred into their daily life, or to bring more ritualistic elements into their life?
Sure. Again, I'll start with the negative way, the things not to do. I think there's a problem here that it's possible to borrow rituals or to make up rituals in a way that really, so that they don't have much soulfulness in the practice of them. If you know what I mean, you kind of play around with ritual, and that's really not enough. We need deep sources of whatever we're going to do. So I recommend to people that they look at their own religious tradition, if they have one. If they've been brought up in their family in a particular tradition and maybe have gone away from it or have lost it, there's a way to recover some of that without buying into the whole thing if that's something they don't feel good about. There's a way of recovering a great deal that's important, that is tinged with the emotions and memories of childhood. That's a very important way of grounding this work with ritual. Another thing I would recommend, and I think it's a very helpful thing, it has been for me, I know, is to explore religious traditions that seem quite foreign to you. I think to go off and explore them. I don't mean to become a member somewhere, but to read the stories, if it's going to take that, or just visit a temple, or go to another country with that purpose in mind. This, by the way, is a very traditional recommendation of people who care for the soul. Travel. Go around and see how other people do things. And that can be very enriching to the soul. Then you come back and you don't have to repeat and mimic those things that you've seen, but you can find ways of weaving whatever has been impressive to you, weaving that into your life. And that enriches and broadens your own experience. And I think what it does, it helps tone down that dogmatic practice of religion that we find so much, that is not very conducive to soul.
Thomas Moore, thanks very much for talking with us.
Thank you.
Thomas Moore is a psychotherapist and the author of Care of the Soul, a guide for cultivating depth and sacredness in everyday life.
It's to the best of our knowledge. I'm Jim Fleming. If you'd like to purchase a cassette copy of the previous hour, please call the radio store at 1-800-747-7444 and ask for program number 418C.
Baseball's Hall of Famer Joe Morgan, one of the few second basemen to make it to the Hall of Fame. He'll talk with Terry Gross about his life in baseball. He has a new autobiography. Other listeners will hear All Things Considered. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum is about to open after years of research, construction, and questions. Does it make sense in Washington? Can it tell the story of the war against the Jews without sacrificing detail to the desire to universalize? That's later today on the tour with a historian who just had those questions, and more on All Things Considered, here on the Ideas Network of Wisconsin Public Radio.
For a fresh sound and a fresh approach, tune to the Ideas Network. You'll hear from interesting hosts and well-informed guests on a wide variety of topics, and we invite you to join the discussion on the Ideas Network of Wisconsin Public Radio.
From National Public Radio News in Washington, I'm Corey Flintoff. Ohio prison officials said that rebellious inmates at a maximum security prison have begun to surrender. One of the inmates' conditions was that the surrender be televised, and inmates were shown filing out of the cell block where they'd barricaded themselves and 5 hostages for 10 days. At least 6 of the prisoners were brought out on stretchers. Most of the prisoners shown so far have come out with their hands raised and were individually searched by prison guards. The 5 remaining hostages still have not been released. 7 inmates and 1 hostage guard were killed during the uprising that began on April 11th. The surrender came after inmate negotiators and the prison warden signed an agreement listing 21 conditions. Nikki Schwartz, a lawyer who's been active in helping to negotiate a resolution to the long standoff, told reporters outside the prison he was confident that the authorities would stand by the terms agreed to.
I asked them specifically whether they intended to abide by the agreements that they're making with the inmates or whether they intended to repudiate them after the hostages were released. And told them that if they intended to do the latter, I was not willing to participate. They assured me that they did intend to keep their word, and that the things that they had agreed to were things that they felt should be done anyway, and that they wouldn't agree to do anything that they didn't intend to follow through on.
Lawyer Nikki Schwartz. The Justice Department has confirmed that investigators in Waco have spotted the bodies of 40 Branch Davidians buried in the burned-out compound. NPR's John Burnett reports.
FBI agents estimate that 10 of the 40 bodies scattered throughout the compound might be those of women and children, according to a Justice Department spokesman. In addition, 3 bodies have been found with bullet wounds to the head. Officials on the scene in Texas do not know whether the victims could have been shot while trying to escape, whether they committed suicide, or whether the corpses were damaged by exploding ammunition in the ruins. Dental records of some of the victims are being sent to Waco from around the country and from the United Kingdom and Australia to help in identifying the remains. Officials say the unearthing of evidence and the identification of the dead will take many weeks to complete. In Waco, I'm John Burnett.
A presidential representative cast new doubts today on the authenticity of a newly discovered document that purports to show that Vietnam held many more prisoners of war than it claimed to in the 1970s. Retired General John Vesey met with President Clinton today to report on his trip to Vietnam. Vesey told reporters after the meeting that many of the facts in the document are wrong. On Wall Street, the Dow Jones Industrials closed lower, losing 4 points to close at 3,449. This is NPR. President Clinton nominated Texas banker John Dalton today to be his Secretary of the Navy. Dalton promised that he would be firm, fair, and sensitive in handling what's likely to be his first major task, reports of sexual assault at the 1991 Tailhook Convention. Dalton, who's 51, is a graduate at the Naval Academy. He's a Democratic fundraiser and a long-time Clinton supporter. News reports have quoted Pentagon sources as saying that the Tailhook report recommends that at least 140 people be considered for disciplinary action. The report, prepared by a Pentagon investigator, has been completed for months. It's expected to be made public on Friday. Senate Democrats failed once again today to break the Republican filibuster of the president's economic stimulus plan, increasing the likelihood that the proposal may fail. NPR's Richard Gonzalez reports.
By a vote of 56 to 43, Democrats failed to win the 60 votes needed to invoke cloture on the debate that